Okay, hello, my friends. My name is Aaron Gerdes. I'm just a professor trying to provide you context in the war in Ukraine. These are four big stories for today. It is December 1st, 2024. So we're going to start with Syria because that's wow. Okay. So Assad regime in Syria has killed more than 600,000 people in Syria. 200,000 are still in prisons and 10 million people are displaced. So it's been bad news in Syria for the last decade. Those numbers are out of 20 million population in Syria in about 2010. So what's actually happened recently was this blitz by rebels who are fighting the Assad government. Now, there's a mix of different groups, coalitions that are working against the government, and then there's a coalition working with the government, which includes Russia. Okay, so along with several jets, tanks, and warehouses with tons of artillery, Syrians just grabbed $15 million Russian Panzer aircraft, anti-aircraft system. They're also grabbing tons of abandoned gear, and you can see in here what it looks like. They're just like the Syrian army just broke and fled. The Russians that were with them broke and fled. So they're getting all kinds of stuff here. Here is the Syrian rebels in the Aleppo area just captured another L-39 light fighter and an M8 chopper. Here they are, more equipment captured at the air base east of Aleppo. Turkish-backed rebels. Oh, by the way, the Turks are also working with the rebels because the Turks and the Syrians don't really get along, and yeah, and the Russians are on the Syrian side. So it's very interesting to watch. Strategically important airfield, which is earlier this year, was struck by Ukrainian forces. What? Ukrainian forces were there? Yeah, they were there striking at the Russians. Here's the article about that. Ukraine says it hit the Russian air base in Syria. So, yep, that was actually happening. Okay, Syrian militants have taken over Bashar al-Assad's residence in Aleppo. The pro-government Syrian media claimed that Assad remains in the country, but it appears that he's actually in Moscow, and Putin wasn't in Moscow, but he was there to meet with Putin. Yeah, it's kind of interesting how that worked. Turkish-backed Syrian rebels tore down a Russian flag from a former Russian base in Syria and burnt it. Okay, now Russian forces suffer major losses in Syria. Commander fired as hundreds go missing. Okay, so Russian forces are facing significant losses during battles in Syria, prompting Moscow to replace the commander of its troops in the country. Ukraine's main intelligence directorate reported on Sunday the Kremlin dismissed General Sergei Kislov, who had been leading the group in Syria. There's a little bit more here. The offensive thrust into Syria's Aleppo governorate that began on November 27th is being carried out by a coalition of Islamist militant groups led by the Turkish-backed former al-Qaeda affiliated group HTS. I pronounced it yesterday. That's the only time I plan to. Okay, so what's happening here is actually really relevant to what we're talking about with Ukraine because the Russians are involved, and the Russians and the Syrians and the Iranians are all on one team. The Turks are on the other team. So it's interesting to see how this works. Now, this is some background for you from Tendar. While the situation in Syria is still developing and in many cases unclear, one big elephant needs to be addressed. Turkey. While we see many Turkish-backed units, SNA, especially east of Aleppo, operating and taking position, it's clear that even the events by rebels, the HTS, which I just talked about earlier, and others, in this sector west of Aleppo, have been tacitly accepted by Ankara. In order to understand this, we need to look back to when Turkey made a deal with Russia and Iran in the so-called Astana deal, which basically was a division of Syria into spheres of influence, keeping Assad on the throne. This, however, was shortly later violated by Russia. Big surprise. That happens. They do that. Iranian and Assad forces, with the help of the Russian Air Force, took vast areas around Aleppo. President Erdogan was betrayed by Putin. While we all shouldn't be surprised that Putin does not give much on agreements, it was a new experience for President Erdogan. On top of this, Russia tried to strong-arm Turkey into accepting the new reality that Assad is going to stay. You see, Russia loves talking about new realities because this is what Russia does. It's about the fait accompli, not about the rules or the treaties. Then came Putin's disastrous decision to launch the full-scale war in Ukraine. Of course, he started it believing that it was going to be a short affair of 3 days, but almost 3 years later, it's clear to everyone to understand the magnitude of Putin's miscalculation. It was monumental. But basically, overnight, Turkey moved up and became the serious player in the Middle East and the Black Sea region. Moving forward to the year 2024, the triple humiliation by Putin against President Erdogan back in 2020 was not forgotten. The events in Ukraine, the Iranian adventures against Israel, as well as Hezbollah's degradation, clearly shifted the power balance in the region. Turkey resisted all attempts by Russia to recognize Assad's rule over Syria, knowing well the weakness of the Russian-Iranian Hezbollah alliance, which had been steadily weakening. And this moment most likely was reached just a few days ago. The collective buildup and attack by several rebel groups was so big in size that Turkish intelligence officials most certainly have picked up on that. The resulting Blitz offensive has completely shaken the power structures in the region, and Turkey moved from being the weakest of the power brokers in the region to the strongest player. Russia and Iran, along with Assad, are the biggest losers. Okay, so that's some background to give you some perspective, because like we have this from the outside looking in, oh, it's all the Middle East, they're all on the same. No, they're not all on the same page. There are some that absolutely hate each other, most notably Saudi Arabia and Iran, and those that line up on either side of that equation between Sunni and Shia. Dictators fall and fall suddenly. The Slava Ukraini photo reflects Ukrainian assistance to Syrian rebels behind the scenes. Our sources say Ukraine probably supplied drones and some logistical and military advice based on good intelligence. Earlier, Ukraine helped anti-Russian forces in Africa, and I showed you that picture earlier. So, yeah, how about that? All right. Now, let's move to big story number 2. So, if we just roll back the clock 30 some odd years, even Russian President Yeltsin admitted the truth. Without Ukraine, the Soviet Union couldn't survive. By this 25 December 1991, Ukraine's democratic choice had sealed the USSR's fate. So this is when Ukraine was breaking away from the USSR 33 years ago. This wasn't a regional phenomenon. The referendum on 1 December 1991 succeeded across Ukraine's entire territory, demonstrating unified desire for sovereignty that Russia still denies today. So it was an 84%, 54%. It was still a majority even in Crimea. So that's what happened 33 years ago. Now, history repeats itself. December 1st, 2013 marked a defining moment in Ukraine's modern history. Ukraine's protest against corruption and Russian influence came at a high cost that continues. 11 years after Ukraine's Euromaidan, Georgians now face the same fight for democracy and sovereignty. Right, the Georgians are going through the same kind of thing. And by the way, the Russians are fond of calling the Euromaidan a coup, and it wasn't a coup. But there was a coup in Georgia. It actually happened, and it was by the ruling party. So they analyzed voter distributions and uncovered voter fraud, and the Georgian Dream's true support lies between 39 and 45%, which would eliminate their parliamentary majority. Call it a coup. It is a coup. Like, what they actually did was fraudulent. So the Georgian Dream is now the Georgian Nightmare, and we're going to see things like this. For the first time, anti-government protesters in central Tbilisi held their ground through the night despite police dispersals. This was enabled by a record 200,000 people turning out of Tbilisi's 1.2 million. Protesters built barricades to resist water cannons with firecracker volleys. In the morning, locals brought food for the demonstrators, and new people are replacing the ones who were standing through the night. So it looks like the Euromaidan all over again. This video will become iconic, the 4th day of the protest against Russian parliamentary support. In a moment, she's going to rise up and give them the middle finger. Now, here's what Steve Rosenberg had to say in his update.
As night fell in Tbilisi, they were building barricades, using anything they could find. People here are angry that the ruling party has suspended Georgia's bid to join the European Union. They believe that Russia is pulling the strings.
Again, history is repeating itself. It's fascinating to watch.
I'm protesting against our government, who is pro-Russian, and they don't want to have any relationship to Europe or USA. and I am here for my freedom, for my future.
Wow. Right. That's exactly what they're there for. Now, this is a Georgian member of parliament saying we are fighting a Russian hybrid war. They're spending an enormous amount of money. Help us. And again, 200,000 people turned out for yesterday's demonstration. It's amazing. Now, here's a scene that could have been lifted from 2014 in Kyiv, now happening in Tbilisi. People bringing food to the protesters so they can stay out there and stand their ground. Georgia president saying, I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of Georgia. A national accord has been reached on the most critical matter. No one can take away Georgia's independence. No one can return Georgia to Russia, and no one can deprive Georgia of its will and its European future. Okay, so people would ask about the president. The president is very weak in Georgia, has very limited ceremonial-like responsibilities. The prime minister is the locus of power, but still she is standing with her people. Meanwhile, former Russian President Medvedev called Georgian president expired and said rejecting elections once led to hangings on lampposts. Well, we'll see how this all plays out. I don't think it's going to go the way he thinks it's going to go. Gabrielis Landsbergis, the foreign minister from Lithuania, says, how many more times are we going to choose to lose to Russia? How many more millions of people are we going to abandon to oppression? Why aren't we making it harder for the Kremlin to sway elections and choke democracies one by one? It's a great question. Next big story. So I talked about this morning, but unfortunately my daily briefs aren't viewed as much as my three big stories, and this is really important. In November, Russian personnel losses exceeded 45,000 troops. On average, they lost 1,524 soldiers every day, or more than one combatant every minute. And I talked about this morning. Now, their numbers are a little different than my numbers. I've actually calculated, every month, and I'm sure they have information that I'm just not privy to. But here, these are all the days I went through each of the daily updates, and I calculate 45,470. I'm 270 off of where they are, and I don't know why, but maybe they know something that I didn't factor in. That means that there's an average of 1,515 Russians off the battlefield every day. And if we look at all this red is just days that it was higher than the last month's high average. That high average in October was 1,354, and it went to 1,515. That means it went up, and that's after going up by 6% from the previous high, which was 1,271. And if you go from the beginning of September, before those two previous highs, it's actually gone up almost 20%. Like, that's just amazing. So 22 days of the 30 days in November were higher than in the highest month in October. So that should give you a sense of what's going on the battlefield. Okay, 6% of all casualties in the war, that's 34 months, 6% was in the last month out of 34 months in the war. So an average monthly losses would be 21,000, and they actually lost 45,000 last month, to give you a sense of that. And that means there's an average loss of 734 per day, as opposed to last month was 1,515. So you just get a sense of the enormity of what was happening last month. Just wanted to point that out so that you would have that if you weren't watching the daily brief. I do the daily brief in the morning. I do the three big stories in the evening. Please subscribe if you haven't already done so. Okay, last big story. Former Trump AG Bill Barr on Kash Patel. This is one of Trump's appointees. Patel had virtually no experience that would qualify him to serve at the highest levels of the world's preeminent law enforcement agency, unquote. Does that mean that he won't pass scrutiny in the Senate? He might, I don't know. But I was also having this conversation on Twitter with Jake Bro. He had said something about Pete Hegseth being unqualified, and I agreed. I wish that it would be someone of Kellogg's rank. And then Jake responded that Pete Hegseth had numerous sexual assault claims against him. The Senate will never confirm him. He'll withdraw his nomination sometime in December. I'm not a prophet. Jake may very well be right. Now, my response to Jake was that I know you're not a fan of Polymarket, but his chances there are lower than Gabbard's. Now, if we look at Polymarket and we look at which Trump picks will be confirmed, Tulsi Gabbard at 62%, about 2/3 chance. Pete Hegseth is even lower at about 56%. RFK Jr. at 70%. Everybody else is an 80 or 90% plus, right? Like Mike Huckabee at 94%, he'll sail through the nomination process, no problem at all. But Tulsi Gabbard and Pete Hegseth are the two that are least likely. For my money, I would say Tulsi Gabbard would be even less likely than Pete Hegseth, but I didn't vote in the prediction market. Okay, last little bit. Darth Putin. On this day, 1991, Ukrainians, including those in Crimea, voted overwhelmingly for independence from the USSR. I don't like that vote, so I'm changing the voters by mass deporting them and replacing them with new voters who vote how they're told. Yeah, there's something to that. All right, my friends, that's all that I have. Thank you for the time. Thank you for the likes and the shares and the subscribes. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.